Thank you very much, Mary. We all have a chance to ask questions in due course, but we've set this up so that the first 3 questions come from people who we know have a particular contribution to make. And we're going to begin with James Alexander, the director of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, for obvious reasons that this is an organisation that's pulled together interests from cities that is already making contributions to the process. And James, over to you. Where have you got James?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a really interesting presentation, a great way to, I think, to open today's event. We're, as you mentioned, James, with C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. We're a network of the world's biggest cities working to cut their carbon emissions. We currently have 75 member cities from all across the world, mega cities, I should add, and collectively they account for between 20 to 25% of global GDP happens in those cities, between 10 and 15% of global population lives in those 75 cities. And so actually when you think about the scales and the numbers and the scale of the challenge that we're trying to face, engaging those cities is absolutely the vital priority. And so, you know, Mary, you talked about business as usual and creating a change from business as usual. The biggest change we can suggest is empower the world's biggest cities. You've got committed mayors. We've got mayors in every city that are committed to take action on climate change. They have engaged citizens that want to see the city and the mayor take action on climate change. They, as you said, are on, in many respects, the front line in the battle against climate change, particularly in very vulnerable areas. And globally, if we look at the urbanization agenda, what we've done is take many people from dispersed rural regions and put them into very dense, compact, vulnerable regions, climate vulnerable regions. And finally, of course, our cities are huge emitters of carbon emissions, and we have to do something about that. And our mayors are committed to do it. So if we want to make that change, we want to change from business as usual, what do we need to do? Well, we believe we need to empower our mayors and empower our mayors to be able to take the action, because ultimately any international agreement is going to be delivered on the local level, particularly when it comes to cities. So we need to create the power for the mayors to take those actions. So many mayors, as you'd imagine, have powers over very significant sectors when it comes to emissions, transport, energy, buildings, planning, economic development. But the big gap, and it links to today's agenda, is finance. Our cities, particularly in developing countries, really need access to more sources of sustainable finance. And actually the biggest problem that our cities report is not that there's a lack of money that exists in the world. The problem is cities can't access it. Cities have no access to international climate finance sources from the World Bank or other development aid agencies or the Green Climate Fund or other things. But also, cities don't have the capacity to access climate finance or access finance generally, to prepare deals, to prepare bankable projects. And so if there's one big thing we can do in Paris that I believe would make an enormous difference, it would be to empower our mayors to access the finance that they need to fulfill their obligations to cut their emissions. So really keen to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much, James. We'll take the 3 and then we can have a little response after that. Now, Caroline Kennedy-Robb, who's the Executive Director of the Africa Progress Panel. We need a microphone. You need a mic, it's coming.
Thank you, Mary. I mean, that was a fascinating talk, so thank you so much. And much of it very much resonates to what we're hearing in Africa. So I think really, really critical points. But at the same time, we're picking up a different narrative in Africa. And what we're being told is that many Africans are saying, look, we don't want climate to be seen as an issue where climate and Africans are going with a begging bowl in hand. We're tired of that scenario. We're tired of going to negotiations and just trying to beg for money. And quite frankly, we haven't got any from the climate financing. Climate financing has failed many African countries. So we want to do things differently. But we don't want to see climate as something that's negative. We want to see it as an opportunity. We want to see it as an opportunity to look at different sectors in different ways. And a really fascinating sector that everybody gets very, very energized about is energy. So if you start discussions about climate change in many African contexts with many Africans, they'll be very polite about the climate and they'll say, yeah, this is important. But if you go through with the energy context, people will get angry and they'll get energized. So what we're hearing from a lot of the policymakers in Africa, why don't we say that climate is an opportunity to redefine the energy needs across Africa? Because if you look at it that way, we can go elsewhere for our climate, for our financing, not the painful climate finance that hasn't delivered for us. Let's look internationally. Let's look at blended ways in which we can raise the money. Because we'll raise that money and then we'll look at energy differently, and climate will give us an opportunity to redefine the energy sector across Africa. But what we're also picking up, and this is where I seek your advice, is that we have these incredible climate negotiations, climate processes. Oh, it's really difficult. Mm-hmm. And then we have all the energy people sitting somewhere else completely, and they're not connected. And that is in Africa, but it's also globally. So I'd like to seek your advice on how to connect these two. Thank you.
Marvellous. Thank you very much, Caroline. Now, Ilmi. Ilmi is one of our own. Ilmi, originally a lawyer, have some identity connection there.
Yeah, I still am. Still a lawyer.
And now leads the ODI's Green Growth unit here at Ilmi. All yours.
Thank you very much. What a rich presentation to commentate on. I guess, Mary, you mentioned a couple of figures that I think are worth bringing out because they change how we think about some of these themes. 70 trillion in infrastructure investment in the next 15 years that's going to be invested one way or the other. The good news is that it's a very small additional cost to make sure that that's low carbon. I think the harder news is that we're not talking about 10 billion in climate finance or 100 billion, we're talking about 70 trillion. And sort of thinking about what that means. And rethinking sort of how we think about what we're talking about when we're talking about climate finance. Much of the conversation of the last 5-10 years has been focused on the public sector mobilizing the business community and what the public sector can do for the business community. And I think for the purpose of this conversation, I want to point out, I think one of the shifts that needs to happen is how the business community thinks about government. Yeah. And how more visionary business leaders think about the role of government. And I think if this shift is going to happen, that has to happen. I think of government in this context, maybe we need to be thinking about it more as in a football match context as a referee. No one goes to a football match to watch a referee.
The referee.
But equally, you can't have fair play without them there. And I think we need, as a business community, start rethinking how we talk about the role of government in our businesses, in our sectors, in our economy, and really embrace that, yeah, no one likes to get a red card, but equally no one wants a free-for-all. Yeah. And that we need to embrace the role of government in making sure that that fair play happens. And that's how we address the inequality issue. Yeah. That's how we address climate change. Look, I think 10 billion of public finance or 100 billion, anything in that order of magnitude is just about enough for goalposts, for marking the pitch, for hiring some referees. Yeah. That's what that money should be spent on, is those types of interventions. And I think making sure that there's fair play. I think, I'm guessing Sheila Whitney on the same team as me here, on Green Growth team at ODI, is probably going to comment on similar themes around fossil fuel subsidies and some related issues. But I think really thinking about making sure that sets up the rules so that 90 trillion can really be shifted towards low carbon. But that is about the business community really understanding that a progressive business leader should be making that message. I not only want to see Unilever changing its supply chains, I want to see Unilever go to the states in which it operates and say, this is what you should expect of all supply chains, because this is the right way to do it. And that, to me, is what a really progressive business community looks like.
Great. Thank you very much, Ilmi. So there's a cluster for you. Interesting questions about the relationship between public and private finance, and disappointment with public, and hopes and expectations for private, but it's not flowing. How do you empower cities? In fact, where do you make the rule that enables cities to raise their own finance? Some cities can, by the way, but it's pretty hard for most to, for example, issue their own bonds. And then reframing the climate debate around energy and finding a more productive conversation, if you like, between the various parts of the energy sector, bearing in mind that new energy looks quite different from old energy. Different actors, And often those conversations are with old energy who are incumbents and very powerful, and the new folks are not in the room. And then ultimately also the change of attitude from business to government so that government can play its proper role as a referee in our markets.
Well, thank you to all three who posed question and informed comment, because what you are, all three of you, doing is trying to change the narrative on how we approach climate change. And I really support that. I welcome the C40 Cities project, welcomed it when it started and saw that it grew enormously and made a big impact in the climate summit. It fits the way that the French presidency is trying to look at the events in Paris, because they're not looking, like in Copenhagen, at just the climate agreement. Minister Laurent Fabius, when he talks about it, and he does this every time, talks about the 4 pillars of what was to be achieved in Paris. And the first one is the important legal framework agreement. The second one is the contribution by every country, which is agreed upon now, in their intended nationally determined contributions. And to me, we need to change the narrative for many developing countries of how they see these INDCs. They're seen a little bit too much now as being another burden, another conditionality. We didn't cause the problem. Why do we have to come forward with what we would do in post-2020, 2025, 2030, etc.? We don't have the capacity and all of it. It's actually the opportunity to set out in the way that Caroline was saying that African countries want to frame their future. Here's the opportunity. Use the INDC to say, all right, this is what we could do, but if we get the investment, if we get the technology, we want to go much faster and much further. And therefore, it's a kind of setting out that ambition. So as far as the cities are concerned and their financing, I actually wouldn't encourage C40 to wait for Paris. I would say C40, focus on Addis and pre-Addis and the G7, and make the case very strongly for all cities to be able to have the financial capacity. And obviously this is a matter for the sovereignty of countries, how they devolve power to cities, but to encourage that will be better for the development of both cities and countries themselves. I think there's an opportunity for that. And for African countries, I absolutely support the fact that they are rightly energized by discussions on clean energy, because African countries need to build an infrastructure of development for a rapidly growing population over the coming decades. And I think that the use of the INDCs will be very helpful. There are also very interesting projects like the African Climate Risk Facility, the ARC facility, that I think are doing excellent work, Richard Wilcox and his team. And I think we need to hear from African countries in the discussions, in the financing for development, in the sustainable development goals, and in the climate discussions precisely, that they are ambitious to go green. Ethiopia is going to go carbon neutral by 2027. We need to hear other African countries making a similar commitment and saying, but we need the support. And we didn't cause the problem. We need the public-private partnership support to do this. And I really like the point that Ilme was making about how business leaders can use their access to political leaders to have a much more informed conversation about the regulatory framework that they need. First of all, they can play their role on the move out of fossil fuel subsidies, but doing so in a way that doesn't drive up food and fuel for the poorest population, so equitable transition, the need to have all countries work to create a business environment which encourages public-private partnerships. And some companies, notably Unilever, Paul Polman is using his asking power, and he does meet with all of the leaders in countries that he goes to, and I wish that more leaders would do likewise. But what I liked most about all three questions was to change the narrative. That's, I think, what I'd like to see coming out of this meeting, from a perspective of the way that cities and business will move forward but leave no one behind.
Exactly. I've got a very interesting question coming through offline on the subsidies question. One thing just perhaps to add to that reframing and narrative change discussion is that we now know, we have a lot of evidence, but we now know that clean technology applied in the energy sector can be deployed rapidly. And we do have a race against time here. So one of the attractions, perhaps not talked about enough, from renewable energy is that you can deliver access to energy fast. And where there is none, where there is no infrastructure, where there is no grid, where there is probably no access to power, renewables will always win on cost. And then as soon as you've built the new infrastructure around the new technologies, renewables will continue to win on cost. So this wasn't the case 20 odd years ago when we talked about clean energy, but it is now. And the future looks better for renewables than it does for the fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So let me, if you forgive me, let me just take this online one, and then because it's directly relevant. I've got a question from Robert Yates at Chatham House, which is essentially about the allocation away from fossil fuel subsidies to other public goods. And he's suggesting universal health coverage. And given the decline in the price of oil and gas at the moment, that it does provide an opportunity for some governments who have committed themselves to very expensive subsidies for fossil fuels to take this moment to shift away to other public goods. Do you have a view on that, Mary? Is that something you would favour and encourage?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting issue, and I think it's important in moving away from fossil fuel subsidies, putting a price on carbon and so on, to ensure that we're talking about investment moving to clean energy as much as possible for the reason that you give, that it's now becoming a good investment and the price is coming down. But I also think it can move to public goods. I wouldn't say that you can have one size fits all, because countries will differ in what they will prioritise. But it does speak to a worry which is indirectly in my mind as I heard that question. There is a worry in the context of financing for development in many developing countries that the aid budget is coming down. It hasn't been now. The UK has been giving good leadership on this, but that not only is the aid budget tending to come down, but there may be some double accounting and switching of money to be climate finance and take away from the aid budget, which basically is so important for health and education. Right. So that worry is there, and indeed the aid budget has not delivered to the 0.7% of all countries that should have made that commitment. So using having some of the move away from fossil fuel subsidies serve to support public goods would help, I think, to
establish, and perhaps a good moment to grab. Right, 3 questions. There's loads. Let me begin with this person here. There's a very familiar face back there. So we'll start with those 2. We'll do it in clusters of 3. Go ahead.
Hi there, I'm Megan Darby from RTCC. We've talked a lot about the need to mobilise clean investment, low carbon investment. I wanted to ask about the flip side. We're seeing a growing divestment movement, and particularly, The Guardian has made a campaign of this, is making a campaign of this. And I wanted to ask very simply, should people who believe in climate justice be divesting from fossil fuels?
That's a great question. We'll take 3. Just go on my back.
Simon Maxwell, I chair CDKN. Hi. The climate justice and pillar 2 of the climate talks about INDCs. There is a view that if we work from the bottom up, cities, renewable technologies, we don't need to worry about global targets. And I just wonder whether the Climate Justice Foundation has a view on the allocation of the 1,000 gigatons we have available to emit CO2. The key figure is that in 2030 we need to emit no more than 42. Current pledges are for 57. Who's going to have the right to emit, and how political and politically difficult will that be in Paris?
That's a great question too. So let's hold that one. The gentleman here in the front. Sorry, it's such a nice example of a concise and accurate question. We might even get 4 in the first word.
I'm Mark Galloway. I'm the director of the International Broadcasting Trust. What do you think the role of public opinion is, and how effective do you think the media is at engaging the public?
Good one. I'll take the gentleman directly behind you because everyone was so good about... This is a model, by the way. It's a model. Right.
Simon Ratcliffe from DFID. Just first of all to say that I think the focus on cities is absolutely spot on. 70 to 80% of emissions emanate from cities, and we've kind of lagged in the way in which we engage with cities as at the coalface.
Yeah.
But there are two huge challenges that I see that we face regarding cities. One is the kind of legacy of everything that surrounds us, which is the infrastructure, the buildings, etc., and the poor design that went into them because they weren't designed from a climate perspective to start off with. And so how do we deal with this huge legacy of inefficient infrastructure that surrounds us? And then on the other side, it's going forward. What are we know them. The design principles for passive buildings we've known about for decades, and yet we don't do it.
Yes.
And so what can we do? Because we don't have the luxury of poor design going forward. How do we enshrine that into the design principles of all the infrastructure and buildings going forward?
So there's a couple of nuances we want to pick up in our discussion there. The first is that buildings are infrastructure. And secondly, in most places there is the investment already in place in inefficiency, and you need to reverse that. And where do the incentives come for that retrofitting program that will be required for urban areas? And finally, the relationship between just open creativity to redesign and rules that require redesign. No? This is a tension, but it should be a creative tension between the obligation to reduce and the freedom to imagine how things might be done differently in the future. Mary.
Well, thank you, James. You answered that last question, which I was least qualified to answer. And so I'll take the other three. First of all, the divestment movement. I think it's very interesting how that divestment movement is really growing in its impact, having started in the United States and now moving to Europe and elsewhere in the world. I always try to encourage that we talk about divestment and reinvestment, not just divestment, and that if people are interested in climate justice, I think it is something that needs to be thought about by all institutions that have funds that need to be looked at. It's almost a due diligence requirement, and I know it can be quite difficult, but there are those who are now willing to provide guidance, foundations and funds that have already divested who are passionate about the issue and willing to be helpful to others. So I believe it could be incorporated in a way in the idea of the UN guiding principles from a climate justice perspective. If you want to respect all human rights, then don't invest in what damages people's lives. And I have to share with you a moment that I had in Geneva when we had a panel on climate change and human rights. And I was on the panel, in fact, with President Tong of Kiribati, and he had just spoken about it. And I was asked to give a reflection at the end. And I said that Eleanor Roosevelt and her commission, who drew up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, never imagined that human activity would cause countries to potentially go out of existence. So when we're talking about the need for all corporations to respect all human rights, I would say corporations need to look at what and indeed not just corporations but all of us in a way, what contribution we're making to hurting those who are in the front line of being more vulnerable to climate and who are least responsible. So I certainly welcome the fact that the divestment and I hope reinvestment movement is going to continue to grow. Simon's question about the allocation of the carbon budget. We have actually looked at that in the foundation. We felt it was necessary to look at the long-term goal, look at the scientific reality. We've come to the conclusion that we need to get to zero carbon by 2050 to have a really good prospect of staying below 2 degrees, zero carbon by 2050. That posed a big question for us as a foundation on climate justice, how to do it the climate justice way. We commissioned research on that. And we have a paper on our website, Zero Carbon, Zero Poverty, the Climate Justice Way. And it was a tough piece of research that actually changed my thinking a little bit, because the researchers concluded that the impacts of climate are going to be so much more severe on the poorest countries that moving to a clean, green economy will be less disruptive than suffering the real pain of increasing cyclones, increasing flooding, increasing drought. And every country, developing country I go to now, they may not want to talk about it in a forum because it's exposing their vulnerability, but they do talk about their vulnerability, which is increasing. So that's the first point. And secondly, we can't get to zero carbon by 2050 unless developing countries are part of that, because they are the major places where infrastructure will be put in. They're the major places of growth of population. And if they are not part of this, then the whole Titanic will go down, and that's the interconnectedness and the need for the human solidarity. So I think it's a very important issue. The role of public opinion and the role of the media in addressing. Do you want an honest answer? There is very good media, some of it represented in this room, but unfortunately, I think post-Copenhagen, the media went very negative, and then there is a lot of bad money driving skeptical opinion. I haven't yet seen the film. What is it? The Somethings of Doubt, the Merchants of Doubt. I actually think that it's not too easy for media to address in stories the complexity of climate. I mean, that can be a problem, but it's such an issue now that I think media could help us with the changing narrative more than is happening. And I really would welcome that, because public opinion is really going to matter. Public opinion mattered in New York. It was expected that maybe 100,000 people would come out in March and September. It shocked a lot of leaders when 400,000 people came out. And I was delighted to be in that incredible atmosphere of people coming out and wanting to be with other people on this issue. And I was with Gru Brundtland. I was one of the elders with Gru Brundtland, and we had our... And then I saw, just a little bit behind me, another, what do you call these things, that I wanted to go behind. And it said, Angry Grannies.
Excellent. Brilliant. Well, I think I'm going to have a look at this side of the room. I won't forget over here, but I'll look over at this. Look, there's a person right in front there. Why don't I take this line here? Lady at the back, sorry. I'll come back, then the next row, and then... Kevin first. I got you.
Thank you. The question I want to ask is that, Mary, you mentioned about the importance of the people lacking access to electricity. And in Africa alone, there are around 650 million, probably more, with no access to electricity. If you look at some of the scenarios that have been developed for Africa by the International Energy Agency and McKinsey, they envisage quite big increases in electricity generation, threefold increases to 2030. At the same time, you have these same scenarios have the number of people without electricity actually rising. And so the question I want to ask, and this is including with increased renewables in the package, and I think it illustrates that renewable technologies are clearly good for the climate. They're not intrinsically good for equity. I mean, they can be good for equity, but they're not. But the question is, are we really forgetting about the energy needs of people who aren't currently connected to the grid, and thinking too much about power generation and not enough about the other part of the equation of who's being left behind?
If you just pass your microphone back. Oops. Well, it doesn't matter. You go first. And then you can
Mary, I agreed with so much of what you said. I'm Alison Doig. I'm from Christian Aid. I agree with so much. It was difficult to pick one bit, but I was really interested that you talked about partnership with affected people and leaving no one behind. But in a really practical way, Christian Aid works with have a number of partners in about 10, 12 countries who want to, as civil society, engage with their own national INDCs. We have to, first of all, raise their capacity as an NGO to know what an INDC is and what it can do for them. But there's absolutely no resourcing for civil society in these countries to engage in that process. So if they're not involved, then they won't benefit, is my question. So really, whether there's any, I know that CDK and ODI are involved in government engagement, which is fantastic, but it's that civil society engagement and the affected people. So any practical recommendations or anything you know in terms of what's happening to engage civil society in poorer countries would be useful.
It's a really strong point. Lady in front of you.
Thank you. First of all, it's been a fascinating lecture. My question really is related to...
Introduce yourself.
Sorry. Amina Khan, I'm a research officer at ODI, at the Growth, Poverty and Equality Program. So the question relates to business as usual. It's basically a comfort zone and the default policy option for public and private actors. So in order to move away from this as usual scenario, it's going to make many uncomfortable. So in light of this, what are the 3 practical measures to reorient stakeholder interests in the public and private sector, where they can evaluate how much of the trade-offs to climate action are perceived than real?
Okay, good point. Mary, do you think you could take a couple more?
Okay.
Because I'm now looking anxiously at the time. So if I could just take 1, 2, and then you've been waiting here.
David Woolcombe, Peace Child International. Thank you, Mary, for a wonderful presentation. But you need to know that we at the grassroots feel bruised, stuck in the cold at Copenhagen, Rio +20, incredibly disappointing, the Brazilians having to take over the UN process of negotiation because they just didn't get to a final document. And now we have the Geneva recommendations, which are even worse. Every paragraph has 11 options. Yeah. It looks like a recipe for total disagreement. Yeah. And we also have George Monbiot in The Guardian on Tuesday saying that you're looking at it from the wrong end. It's like looking at the slave trade and trying to stop people buying slaves once they get to America rather than stopping the trade. Yeah. And I think that question about the wrong end of the pipe, stopping the actual emission of carbons by the carbon producers, not addressed in the Geneva document at all. What, as a representative of the leadership of this negotiation, do you feel about that, Mary?
Right next door.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. It's a question for Mary about your role in the B team, and in particular, the development of natural capital accounting. And we can see that there is full backing for this in the UK with the Natural Capital Committee and the support that the cross-party coalition has given to the Climate Change Act. So it's not an election issue. It's clearly a corporate adoption issue. Can you comment on how the B team is responding?
And last one, just here. Sam, we might get you another round, okay?
Mayor Hillman from Policy Studies Institute. What I fear about all the questions that have been posed to you, and indeed relating to what you had to say, exudes what I believe to be totally unrealistic optimism that if we play our cards right, we will be able to get out of this problem of climate change. The reality is that unless you can show how it is possible in the near future to reverse the process, which is, for instance, melting the ice caps, just as an illustration of this, unless you can show that, things can only get worse. And I think that casts an altogether different approach needed than one that holds out the belief that there is indeed light at the end of the tunnel. And just as a last point, to reinforce what I have to say, I commend to anybody listening to what I'm saying now to the Global Commons Institute's website, which has got on its recently completed model called Carbon Budget Allocation Tool, on which you can see what the concentrations of CO2 per capita, what the acidification of the oceans, what sea level rise is, and so on, can be seen against any proposal that is currently being made.
Okay, thank you. First of all, Kevin, your point about those who don't have access to clean energy, to electricity or to clean cook stoves. I think it's really important that we realise now that the potential for off-grid solar and small hydro and other forms, and also the clean cook stoves. I'm on the lead group of the Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, and that has grown significantly in recent years and is reaching I think it's something like 500 million now. So, I mean, that's really beginning to make a difference. It isn't yet a movement in the way I'd like to see, but it's making a lot of progress. One of the recommendations that my foundation has made and tried to get both governments and World Bank and others to listen to is, why don't we use social protection systems to get clean energy to people? Because it's the upfront cost of the gadget that prevents people from being able, and they pay a lot for their kerosene and candles. So if we could just deal with that. So I think we could reach far more quickly. And I really believe it's more possible to do more on that in a way that James was talking about, because the cost is coming down, and if we just get public-private partnerships, entrepreneurs getting support for it. I mean, the School Forum will be having a meeting in Oxford in April, and I think there'll be a lot of discussion of that issue. On the question of civil society participating in the INDCs, I think there's a problem that for a lot of countries it's not a very consultative process anyway, which is a problem. I was very pleased to see in Chile, when I was there for a high-level women leadership meeting, that that Chile is opening up quite a consultative process, and civil society has been able to have quite an input. So there are sort of good models and bad models. I think for a lot of countries, they have no idea that their government, that their Ministry of Environment is preparing an INDC. And the words INDC haven't
resonated
so we need a lot of practical, we do need support. I know that the UN agencies, UNDP and UNEP are helping a number of countries, but they are basically helping governments. And I think they need to be reminded that they should also be helping civil society in that. And I would hope that civil society would see the INDCs as being a real opportunity for developing countries to make their case for their ambition, and that they need the investment and the technology to carry through on it. The question about if we move from business as usual, it's going to make us uncomfortable. I think that is something that we should be aware of. It should be disruptive in a good sense and uncomfortable. And I think the way to do it is to address, in the way we're doing in this conversation, how we can change the parameters of moving forward. On the text. I think I should maybe be a little bit more hopeful about what's happening at the lugubrious process of the negotiations, because what happened in Lima was there were many countries not satisfied at all, because it was basically a co-chair's text that they didn't own. So it went from, 37 pages to 86 pages, but it's now owned by the parties. And there was a much better spirit in Geneva as a result. And there was a lot of discipline. When South Africa spoke on behalf of the G77 and China in the plenary, every other country, grouping that was affiliated to that, said, we agree with G77 and China, and so for the first time ever, we're not going to have a long speech. There is a discipline in this process, which I think is hopeful. And the point about the text is that Paris will be successful if it puts us on a pathway to a safe below 2 degrees world. And to be on that pathway, it needs to have two things in it that are extremely important, and two that my foundation is strongly arguing. It must have a long-term goal, and there is text about a long-term goal there, and it must have a review process. We have to be reviewing to ramp up the ambition, because Paris won't do it. We know that. So we've got to, and the other things is it has to have a commitment to both gender equality, because in the other process there's a goal on gender equality. So we have to have gender equality in the operative part, and I would argue, for the reasons that I've been talking about, it has to have a commitment to climate action, respecting, hopefully respecting, protecting and fulfilling human rights, but at least respecting human rights. And I was with Christiana Figueres and the UN team under the Secretary General in Turin 2 days ago, and there is a feeling that it won't be easy, but we can get a climate agreement that brings us forward. The B team. I was very pleased that the B team in Davos made a commitment not to zero carbon by 2050, but to zero net emissions by 2050, that they will themselves work in their businesses for this, and they will try to encourage other businesses. And the reason they did this was they said there are going to be leaders and there are going to be laggards, and there will be more laggards than leaders. So we are actually going to set a higher bar in order to try to make the case that there is an urgency about this. The science is telling us we cannot wait. And there was a very good discussion about the natural capital accounting, and I think, again, the B team will try to give leadership on that for good reason. And I do acknowledge the importance of the joint statement of the three party leaders in this country, the cross-party support. I think that really resonated around the world and was good leadership. For an Irish person to say that now, come on, that's pretty generous. And finally, I think it's interesting, and I'm glad you made the point about the fact that we seem to be totally unrealistic in our optimism. There are two ways in which we can try to motivate about climate. One is fear, and the other is hope. Yeah. In my experience, hope gets you further than fear in motivating people. Fear terrifies people, and they get passive, and they say, well, there's nothing we can do, and that's it. Whereas if we say we must change the narrative, we must do, it's the only way I can see that we will energize enough, and we have to keep reminding ourselves of the science. And the climate agreement in Paris has to be true to the science, although it will not be enough. And I think, to your point, James, because it will be perceived that the INDCs will be synthesized by the UN and that NGOs will be calculating that they will not be enough, have to be balanced by what the other side, the fourth pillar of what everybody else is doing, cities and forests and sectors and carbon pricing and all these things, and it still won't be enough, which is why we need the long-term goal in there and a review process to ratchet up the ambition. On the question of optimism, just to finish, I was on a panel a few years ago with Archbishop Tutu, Desmond Tutu. I've had lots of opportunity to be with him over a long period, but particularly as elders more recently. He's now an honorary elder. And about 2 years ago, we were on a panel in New York as elders, and there was a woman journalist questioning us in front of an audience of young people. And when Desmond Tutu's in front of young people, he really gets excited, and he was, even more ebullient than usual. And eventually she asked him somewhat sharply, she said, Archbishop Tutu, why are you such an optimist? And he looked at her, and he shook his head, and he said, oh no, dearie, he always calls people dearie, oh no, dearie, he said, I'm not an optimist, I'm a prisoner of hope. And I think we have to be prisoners of hope going forward.
The process can't be reversed. All that can happen is that it's slowed down.
Yes, it's true. So, thank you very much. Tremendous questions. We're going to take a break, have a cup of coffee or whatever, and then return for a panel session where there is more opportunity to ask questions and get to the grips of these issues. So, for now, thank you very much, Mary, but you won't be going away.
Okay, thank you.